Okay, so the review for this week. It's actually going to be a quick review, at least for a couple of the discussion boards. So, what we began last week was this idea of complete altruism. So it's the exact opposite of the first theme of our course, radical egotism. Radical egotism, everything was about me. The only thing that mattered was my interests, my desires, my goals. Complete altruism is the opposite. Everything I do is for others. I'm devoted to others. That is my kind of inclination and my intention is to do whatever I can to help others. Completely sacrificing myself. My life, my desires, my goals don't matter. So again, complete opposite of radical egotism. Even though they may not appear always to be opposite, and that I talk about in the intro video for this week. But regard to the discussion board, so utilitarianism was the overwhelming answer in terms of which moral theory requires you to devote the most time and effort to yourself, or to others, excuse me. And I think, there was some really good points here. One of the good reoccurring points is this idea of utilitarianism calls you to be attentive to the needs and desires of others. You have to be aware of what other people want and what other people gain pleasure from. And you have to be aware and really have to think through every decision as to who that's affecting, how that's affecting them, and then do what produces the most overall happiness. And I think that was a really good argument as to why utilitarianism would be the most self-sacrificial, or at least most devotional to others. Two things just to kind of keep in mind with regard to this further thought. Actually, three things. Does utilitarianism, by including your own happiness, somebody might say, well, that's not quite as giving to others or focused on others because, in each one of these calculations, I also have to think about myself and what would make me happy. So does that return utilitarianism to a little bit more of a self-centric position than maybe some of the other moral theories? The other thing to think about here was Kant. Kant, the truly moral person, is doing what they're doing because it's the right thing to do, and the right thing to do is connected with pure reason. Just doing what you're supposed to do because that's the rational thing to do. So one could argue, certainly, that is the least focused on oneself because you're following this universal moral law, and you're doing it simply because it's right. You're not taking your desires into consideration at all. And finally, natural law. One of the principles of natural law is sociability. So we're naturally called to be connected to others and called to be in relationships with others. So again, there is that kind of element. Certainly, and maybe it's not the most other-centered or the most focused on the needs of people around you, but certainly that is important in that theory. Okay, so the next discussion board was this idea of the giving tree. And the giving tree is really fascinating. It's such a complex story when you really kind of get into it. It doesn't seem like that, and that's because it's a children's story, or at least it can be read to children, but there is certainly adults' themes within it and themes to reflect upon. And in the discussion boards, there were a good group of you who said the tree is moral. The tree is giving. The tree is devoting herself to the boy. And certainly at first glance, the tree looks like a complete altruist. The tree looks like an entity, a being, that is just completely devoted to others and willing to do whatever it takes to help them. And in that regard, we would say the tree is loving, wants the boy to be happy, wants the boy to succeed, and is literally willing to sacrifice its own life, or at least its own body, for the boy. Many of you know that this is kind of like a parent who gives and devotes themselves completely to their kids. And I think there certainly is an element, you can't deny there's an element of generosity there in giving that many people would applaud. On the other side, there is this real question as to whether the tree is really helping the boy. Because a number of posts said, look, the tree is helping the boy. And I think that's not quite as certain as you might think at first glance. Because clearly the tree gives to the boy, and gives him materials that he needs in order to accomplish his desires. So, does he really need this house? Does he really need this boat? Does he really need this money? So on and so forth. We could question that. But, he asks for it, and she gives it to him. But in another sense, so in that sense, she helps him. But in another sense, she doesn't help him because he doesn't seem to become a better person throughout the story. It seems like throughout the story and throughout his life, because this takes place over a lifetime, he is not a moral person. He's not a good person. He's a self-absorbed and selfish person. And all he really cares about is himself, even if it means hurting someone who supposedly he loves. At least in his youth he did love, but now he doesn't. At least it doesn't appear like that. And so he becomes very dependent, he becomes kind of selfish, he becomes rude, so on and so forth. And one could argue the tree enables that, helps him continue to be selfish and rude and so on and so forth. Doesn't work for it. He doesn't deserve all this sacrifice and these materials. And, if we go back to the analogy of the tree being a parent, one could argue that, look, a parent, this obligation is to raise not simply a kid that gets what he wants or she wants, but becomes a better person, becomes their full self, their best self. And in that regard, you could argue the tree didn't accomplish that goal, didn't help the boy become better, and in that case, perhaps was immoral. Some might even go so far as to say, look, did the tree really love the boy? Or did the tree simply gain happiness when he was around? So, she would just give the kid what he wants, so hopefully the kid will come back, in other words, like, oh, please, please come back, I'll give you whatever you want, I'll give you that candy, and so on and so forth. And in that case, you might say, is that generosity even good? And it raises the broader issue of, is generosity always good? Normally our gut reactions say, yes, being generous is good, but to be generous to someone who takes advantage of one's generosity, to be generous to someone who becomes worse as a person because of that generosity, in that case, generosity might not be good, and that is certainly worthy of consideration. And the final point I'll leave you with regard to the story, is this notion that, did she simply give the boy whatever he wanted? Some might argue, no, she gave him the materials to get what he wanted. So she gave him the apples, and he had to go then sell the apples to make money. She gave him the branches, and he had to go make the house. He wanted a boat, she gave him her trunk, and he had to go make the boat. So somebody might argue that, look, the tree also required the boy to do something. So worth considering. Okay, the final discussion board was this idea of the Jesus story. Jesus and the woman with the expensive perfume. So one kind of point of clarification. The woman gave this perfume, and it was really expensive. It was actually 300 days worth of a kind of a working person's salary. So it's really expensive ointment. And she anoints Jesus with it, washes his feet, and the disciples are like, what's going on here? That money could have been used for the betterment of the poor, and it would have been so much more useful, it would have affected many more people. It's kind of like a waste. And Jesus says, no, this woman did what she did out of love, and we're to be praised, and she'll be remembered. And so you would think from a complete altruist point of view that Jesus would have said, yeah, you know what, give it to the poor. There's more of them. They're in greater need. Don't think about me, think about others. But he doesn't. And I think this story really connects with the reading that you're going to do this week on Susan Wolf, where essentially what it seems like is Jesus saying, acts of love sometimes require that you give more to those that you love than kind of just the general public or just the general population of those in need. That there's times when, in order to show that love, in order to make that love real and concrete, you devote more of your time or your resources to that person. And Jesus essentially seems to defend the woman on the grounds that, look, that's okay, because love is fundamentally good. All right. Have a great week ahead, and nice week on the discussion boards that just passed.